It was just a photo of a mother and son in 1885, but their hands reveal a dark secret. The photograph arrived at the Historical Preservation Society in Richmond, Virginia, on a humid Tuesday morning in March. Sarah Mitchell, a curator specializing in post-Civil War American photography, carefully removed the cardboard frame from the manila envelope. The image showed a black woman, perhaps in her 40s, seated in an ornate studio chair with her hand resting on the shoulder of a young boy standing beside her. Both subjects wore their finest clothes. She in a dark dress with a white collar, he in a pressed suit that looked slightly too large for his thin frame. Sarah had seen hundreds of such photographs from the 1880s. Studio portraits were becoming more accessible to formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction, and families treasured these images as symbols of their hard-won freedom. Yet something about this particular photograph held her attention longer than usual. The woman's eyes carried a weight that seemed to reach across nearly 140 years. The boy, who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, stood with a rigid formality that suggested he'd been coached on how to remain perfectly still. The envelope had come from an estate sale in Charleston. A handwritten note tucked inside read, "My great-great-grandmother Clara and her son Thomas, taken 1885, Richmond." The only photograph we have of her. The sender, a woman named Patricia Coleman, had included her phone number and a request that the society help preserve and document the image. Sarah placed the photograph under her desk lamp, adjusting the angle to catch the light. The studio backdrop showed a painted garden scene, common for the era. The photographer had captured remarkable detail: the texture of the fabric, the slight blur of the boy's left hand where he'd moved during the long exposure, the careful arrangement of Clara's skirts, professional work, probably from one of Richmond's better studios that had begun serving black clientele after the war. She reached for a magnifying glass, a habit born from years of examining historical photographs for authenticating details. Photographers of that era often left subtle signatures in their work, specific props, backdrop styles, even the way they positioned their subjects' hands. As Sarah moved the lens slowly across the image, studying the composition, she paused over Clara's hands. The right hand rested on Thomas's shoulder, but it was the left hand, folded in her lap, that caught Sarah's attention. Even in the sepia tones of the aging photograph, she could see something unusual. The skin on Clara's wrists appeared different, textured, marked. Sarah leaned closer, her breath catching slightly as she adjusted the magnification. Around both wrists were unmistakable lines, bands of scarred tissue that stood out even in the soft focus of 19th century photography. Sarah sat back in her chair, her heart beating faster. She had seen similar markings before in documented photographs of formerly enslaved people. These weren't ordinary scars. They were the permanent evidence of shackles, worn for so long that they had left their mark forever on human skin. Sarah spent the rest of that morning photographing the image with high-resolution equipment, creating digital files that would allow her to examine every millimeter of the picture without risking damage to the fragile original. The photograph was in remarkably good condition for its age. Someone in the Coleman family had cared for it well over the generations. As the files loaded onto her computer screen, she zoomed in on Clara's wrists, and the evidence became even clearer. The scarring formed distinct bands, approximately 2 inches wide on each wrist. The tissue appeared raised, discolored, permanent. In the magnified image, Sarah could see how Clara had positioned her hands deliberately, perhaps trying to hide the marks with the folds of her dress. But the photographer's lighting had caught them anyway, preserving evidence that Clara herself might have preferred to conceal. Sarah pulled up her database of Civil War-era records and began searching for documentation. The year 1885 was 20 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, 17 years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment. Many formerly enslaved people were building new lives, establishing families, working paid jobs, exercising their right to vote. Yet the physical and psychological scars of bondage persisted. These marks on Clara's wrists told a story that transcended the formal portrait's surface. She called Patricia Coleman that afternoon. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, slightly breathless. "Hello? Mrs. Coleman? This is Sarah Mitchell from the Historical Preservation Society in Richmond. I'm calling about the photograph you sent us." "Oh yes, thank you so much for calling back. I wasn't sure anyone would be interested in an old family photo, but it's the only image we have of Clara, and I thought maybe you could help us learn more about her life." Sarah chose her words carefully. "Mrs. Coleman, I'm very glad you sent this to us. The photograph is historically significant, and we'd like to include it in our collection with your permission. But I need to ask you some questions. What do you know about Clara's life before this photograph was taken?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Not much, honestly. Family stories say she was born enslaved somewhere in South Carolina. She came to Richmond sometime after the war ended. She worked as a seamstress, raised Thomas on her own. He was my great-grandfather. But Clara herself rarely talked about her past, according to what Thomas told his children. Do you know where in South Carolina she might have come from? What plantation? What family might have held her?" No specific names were ever passed down. Thomas said his mother wanted to leave all of that behind. She told him once that the past was meant to stay buried, that they should look forward, not back. Sarah understood that impulse. Many survivors of slavery had made the same choice, trying to protect their children from the horror of what they'd endured. But sometimes the past refused to stay buried. Sometimes it left marks that couldn't be hidden, evidence that demanded acknowledgement. Mrs. Coleman, when I examined the photograph closely, I noticed something important. Clara's wrists show significant scarring, consistent with prolonged physical restraint. These are marks that many enslaved people carried. I believe this photograph may document not just Clara's freedom, but also the permanent evidence of her bondage. The silence on the phone lasted longer this time. When Patricia finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. She never told them. Thomas never knew. All these years, this photograph has been in our family, and none of us saw it. None of us knew what we were looking at. Sarah spent the next week immersed in research. The Historical Preservation Society's archives contained extensive records from the Civil War and Reconstruction periods, including slave narratives, plantation records, bills of sale, and manumission papers. She began with South Carolina, knowing that Clara had come from somewhere in that state. The research was painstaking and often heartbreaking. Plantation ledgers recorded human beings as property, listed alongside livestock and equipment. Names were frequently incomplete. Enslaved people were often identified only by first names, sometimes just by age and gender. Clara was a common name in the records, appearing dozens of times across different counties. Sarah contacted colleagues at universities and historical societies throughout South Carolina. She sent them the high-resolution images of the photograph, asking if anyone recognized details that might indicate a specific region or photographer. Victorian-era studio photography had regional variations. Certain backdrop styles, props, and lighting techniques were associated with particular photographers or cities. A response came from Dr. Marcus Webb, a professor of African American history at the College of Charleston. He had studied Reconstruction-era photography extensively and recognized elements in Clara's portrait that suggested the work of Jonathan Blake, a Richmond photographer who had operated a studio on Broad Street from 1880 to 1895. Blake had been unusual for his time, a white photographer who actively solicited black clients and treated them with dignity, creating formal portraits that rivaled those made for wealthy white families. If this is Blake's work, Doctor, Webb wrote in his email, then we can narrow down the location and possibly find studio records. Blake kept meticulous logs of his clients. If Clara sat for this portrait, there might be a record of it. Sarah felt a surge of hope. She contacted the Virginia Historical Society, which held Blake's surviving papers. Within 2 days, she was sitting in their reading room with 3 leather-bound ledgers spread before her. Blake's handwriting was precise and careful. He had recorded not just names and dates, but often brief notes about his subjects. First portrait after emancipation, celebrating new home, family reunited after years apart. She found the entry on a Thursday afternoon, May 15, 1885. Clara, portrait with son Thomas. Lady spoke little but carried herself with great dignity. Boy approximately 10 years. Payment $2.50, paid in full. Sarah stared at the entry, her fingers trembling slightly as she transcribed it into her notebook. $2.50. A significant sum for someone working as a seamstress in 1885. Clara had saved money and made a choice to have this portrait made, to leave evidence that she and her son existed, that they were free, that they were a family. The decision to sit for this photograph had been deliberate, meaningful. But Blake's notes said nothing about the scars, nothing about Clara's past. Sarah needed to dig deeper. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah had posted queries on several genealogy forums used by researchers tracking African American family histories. These communities were invaluable resources, filled with people who had spent years tracing ancestors through fragmentary records, oral histories, and DNA analysis. A woman named Dorothy Harrison responded to Sarah's post. Her message was detailed and carefully written. I've been researching the Ashford Plantation in Beaufort County, South Carolina. My great-great-grandfather was enslaved there until 1865. I have copies of the plantation ledgers, and there's a Clara listed among the field workers in the 1850s and 1860s. The records show she had a son born in 1875, which would make him about 10 in 1885. Could this be your Clara? Sarah's pulse quickened as she read the message. She replied immediately, asking Dorothy to send copies of whatever records she had. The documents arrived by email that evening, scanned pages from plantation ledgers written in fading ink. The Ashford Plantation had been one of the larger rice plantations in the Low Country, operating with more than 200 enslaved workers at its peak before the Civil War. The ledgers were brutally clinical in their detail. Each enslaved person was listed with an estimated value, their work assignments, any punishments administered, births, and deaths. The handwriting was elegant, the penmanship beautiful, documenting atrocity with careful precision. Sarah found Clara's name on a page dated 1863. Clara, female, approximately 20 years, field worker value $800. Her hands shook as she continued reading. The next entry, dated 3 months later, included a note. Clara, disciplined for attempted escape. Confined to quarters for 2 weeks. Shackled. There it was. The first direct evidence. Sarah read the words again, feeling the weight of what they meant. Clara had tried to run. She had been caught, punished, shackled. The scars in the photograph suddenly took on even deeper meaning. These weren't just marks from regular work restraints. They were evidence of punishment, of resistance, of a young woman who had refused to accept her bondage without fighting back. Sarah contacted Dorothy immediately, and they arranged to speak by phone the next morning. Dorothy's voice was warm, but carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent years confronting difficult truths. "I've been working on this research for 5 years," she explained. "The Ashford plantation is where most of my mother's family came from. It's not easy work reading these records, seeing your ancestors reduced to property values and punishment logs." "I understand," Sarah said quietly. "Thank you for sharing this with me." The entry about Clara's attempted escape and subsequent shackling, that matches what we see in the photograph. The scarring on her wrists is consistent with prolonged restraint. "Do the records show when Clara left the plantation?" Sarah asked. Dorothy's voice became somber. "That's where it gets complicated. The records end abruptly in early 1865, right around the time Sherman's troops came through the region. Many of the enslaved people fled when they heard the Union Army was approaching. The plantation owner, Richard Ashford, tried to move some of them inland to avoid losing them, but according to family stories, many just walked away when they saw their chance. Clara might have been among them." Sarah reached out to Patricia Coleman again, this time with more questions about Thomas, Clara's son in the photograph. If Clara had been born around 1843 and enslaved on the Ashford plantation until 1865, then she would have been approximately 22 when freedom came. Thomas was born in 1875, 10 years later. What had happened in that decade? Patricia invited Sarah to visit her home in Alexandria, Virginia. She lived in a modest townhouse filled with family photographs, spanning 5 generations. The walls told a visual history of the Coleman family. Graduations, weddings, military service, family reunions. But the oldest photograph, the one of Clara and Thomas, held the place of honor in the living room, framed and carefully preserved. Patricia was a woman in her 60s, a retired schoolteacher with kind eyes and her great-great-grandmother's dignified bearing. She brought out a cardboard box filled with family documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, a Bible with family names inscribed on the opening pages. "Thomas lived until 1952, Patricia explained, carefully handling a yellowed newspaper clipping. "He died at 77. This is his obituary from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. It says he worked for the railroad for 40 years, was a deacon at First African Baptist Church, had 4 children and 12 grandchildren. He was well respected in the community." Sarah read the obituary carefully. It mentioned Thomas's birth in Richmond in 1875 and his long career, but said nothing about his mother Clara. "Do you have any letters or documents in Thomas's own handwriting? Anything that might give us insight into his mother's life?" Patricia nodded and pulled out a small leather journal. This was Thomas's diary. He started keeping it in 1920, when he was 45. "My grandfather said Thomas became more reflective as he got older, started writing down memories and family stories. There are some entries about Clara." Sarah opened the journal with trembling hands. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but still legible. Thomas's handwriting was careful and deliberate, the penmanship of someone who had received a good education but had practiced writing late in life. She found the first entry about Clara, dated September 1923. "Mother would have been 80 this year if she were still with us. I find myself thinking more about her lately, wondering about the stories she never told me. She passed when I was only 30, and I regret now that I never pressed her to speak of her life before I was born. She worked herself to exhaustion, taking in sewing and mending to give me opportunities she never had. She was the strongest person I have ever known." Sarah turned the pages carefully, finding another entry from 1925. "I discovered something today that troubles me greatly. While sorting through Mother's belongings, items I've kept in a trunk for years, I found a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were iron cuffs, the kind used to shackle enslaved people. They were rusted and broken, but unmistakable. Why did Mother keep these? What did they mean to her? I remember as a child noticing scars on her wrists, but when I asked about them, she would only say she had hurt herself long ago and changed the subject. Now I understand what I was too young to comprehend then." With Dorothy Harrison's help, Sarah began piecing together Clara's journey from South Carolina to Virginia. The post-war years were chaotic, with millions of formerly enslaved people moving across the South, searching for family members, seeking work, trying to build new lives. Many records from this period were lost or never created in the first place, but Sarah found fragments. A researcher at the Freedmen's Bureau Records in Washington, D.C., discovered a Clara listed on a rations distribution log in Charleston in 1866. The notation read, "Clara, no surname given, approximately 23 years, in need of assistance, traveled from Beaufort County." The Bureau had been established to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, providing food, medical care, and assistance with labor contracts and education. Sarah also found Clara's name in the marriage records at Richmond City Hall. In 1874, Clara had married a man named Samuel Thompson. The marriage certificate listed both parties as colored and noted that Clara signed with an X. She could not write her own name. Samuel's occupation was listed as laborer. Thomas's birth certificate, dated March 1875, listed both parents, Clara Thompson and Samuel Thompson. But there was no record of Samuel after that. Sarah searched death certificates, census records, city directories. Samuel Thompson seemed to disappear from the historical record after Thomas's birth. Patricia had heard family stories suggesting that Samuel had died when Thomas was an infant, but there were no specifics, no details about what had happened. Mother never spoke of my father. Thomas had written in his diary in 1927. "I have no memory of him, no stories, nothing but a name. Mother raised me alone, and when I was old enough to ask questions, she would tell me only that he was gone, and that we must make our way without him. I learned not to press her on subjects that brought such sadness to her eyes." Sarah contacted Dr. Webb in Charleston again, sharing everything she had discovered. He suggested looking at church records. Many black churches had kept detailed membership logs and community records during Reconstruction. These congregations had served as centers of community life, providing not just spiritual guidance but also practical assistance, education, and social networks. Dr. Webb searched the records of churches in Richmond's Jackson Ward neighborhood, where many black families had settled in the 1870s and 1880s. He found Clara listed as a member of Ebenezer Baptist Church starting in 1876. The notation beside her name read, "Widow, one child, seamstress." So Samuel had died, probably within a year or two of Thomas's birth, leaving Clara alone with an infant son in a city where she had no family, no connections, in a country barely a decade removed from the institution that had held her in bondage for more than 20 years. The photograph from 1885 took on new dimensions of meaning. Clara, at approximately 42 years old, had survived slavery, escape, widowhood, and a decade of raising a child alone. She had worked as a seamstress, saved money, and chosen to have a formal portrait made with her son. This wasn't just a simple studio photograph. It was a declaration of survival, of dignity reclaimed, of a mother's determination to document her love for her child. Sarah contacted Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a medical historian who specialized in studying the physical evidence of slavery's brutality. Dr. Martinez had examined dozens of photographs similar to Clara's, documenting the ways that bondage had left permanent marks on survivors' bodies. She agreed to analyze the high-resolution images of Clara's wrists. Her report arrived 3 days later, detailed and sobering. Dr. Martinez explained that the type of scarring visible in Clara's photograph was consistent with iron shackles worn for extended periods, likely weeks or months at a time. The marks suggested not just restraint during work, but punitive confinement, the kind of shackling used to prevent escape or punish resistance. The scarring pattern indicates that the restraints were likely too tight, cutting into the skin repeatedly, Dr. Martinez wrote. Over time, this would cause not just surface wounds, but deep tissue damage, resulting in the kind of permanent scarring we see in this photograph. The fact that these marks are so clearly visible 20 years after emancipation tells us how severe the original trauma must have been. Dr. Martinez's report also noted something else. In examining the photograph carefully, I observed that Clara has positioned her hands in a way that partially conceals the scarring. Her right hand is placed prominently on her son's shoulder, but her left hand is folded inward, with the wrist turned away from the camera. This suggests she was conscious of these marks and perhaps ambivalent about their visibility. Yet the photographer's lighting captured them anyway. Whether this was intentional on the photographer's part or simply the result of professional lighting techniques, we cannot know, but the result is that this photograph preserves evidence Clara might have preferred to hide. Sarah thought about Jonathan Blake, the photographer who had made this portrait. Had he noticed the scars? Had Clara mentioned them? Or had they simply been there, part of her physical reality, impossible to completely conceal even in a carefully posed studio portrait? She returned to Blake's ledgers at the Virginia Historical Society, looking for any additional notes about the session. Blake had been known for treating his black clients with respect, but he had also been a businessman operating in a deeply segregated society. What had he seen when Clara sat before his camera? There were no additional notes, but Sarah found something else. Blake had made 2 prints of Clara's portrait, not just one. The standard practice was to make 1 print for the client, unless additional copies were specifically requested and paid for. Yet Blake's records showed 2 prints beside Clara's entry. Sarah wondered if Blake had kept a copy for himself. Many photographers maintained sample books showing examples of their work, and some had begun collecting portraits documenting the lives of formerly enslaved people, recognizing their historical importance even then. She contacted the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, which held Blake's surviving sample books. A curator named James Patterson agreed to search their collection. 2 weeks later, he called Sarah with news. We found it. Blake kept a copy of Clara's portrait in a leather-bound album labeled Portraits of Dignity, 1880-1890. There are about 40 photographs in this collection, all of black clients, all formal portraits. Blake apparently saw these images as historically significant. There's a handwritten note on the page opposite Clara's photograph. Would you like to know what it says? Sarah's heart was pounding. Yes, please. James read Blake's words aloud. Clara came to my studio with her young son in May 1885. She spoke little, but her bearing commanded respect. I noticed marks upon her wrists, the unmistakable evidence of bondage. When I gently inquired, she told me she wished the photograph to show her and her son as they were, a free woman and her free child. She did not wish to hide the past, she said, but neither did she wish it to define her entirely. I photographed her as she requested, with her son beside her, both in their finest clothes, dignified and free. Yet the camera captured what words perhaps could not, that freedom does not erase the scars of slavery, it only allows us to live despite them. Sarah's research into Thomas's life revealed how Clara had invested everything in her son's future. Despite her limited income as a seamstress, Clara had enrolled Thomas in the Richmond Colored Normal School, one of the first institutions dedicated to educating black children in Virginia after the war. The school's surviving records showed Thomas's attendance from 1883 to 1889 from age 8 to 14. Patricia showed Sarah another document from the family collection, a certificate of completion from the normal school, dated June 1889, bearing Thomas's name and signed by the principal, a man named Nathaniel Freeman. The certificate confirmed that Thomas had completed the full course of study in reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and moral philosophy. Mother believed education was everything, Thomas had written in his diary in 1928. She would take in extra work, sewing late into the night by lamplight, to ensure I could attend school rather than work. Other boys my age were apprenticed to trades or working in tobacco warehouses, but Mother insisted I must learn to read and write, that knowledge was the only inheritance she could give me that could never be taken away. Sarah found enrollment records showing that the school's tuition had been $3 per term, with 3 terms per year. For a widowed seamstress supporting herself and a child, $9 annually for education would have been a significant sacrifice. Yet Clara had paid it year after year, ensuring Thomas received opportunities that slavery had denied her. The records also showed something else. In 1887, when Thomas was 12, Clara herself had enrolled in the school's evening program for adult literacy. The notation in the ledger was brief. Clara Thompson, age 44, wishes to learn to write her name and read the Bible. Patricia hadn't known this detail. She stared at the record with tears in her eyes. She learned to read. After everything she had endured, after years of slavery when teaching enslaved people to read was illegal, she went to school with her own son. She was in her 40s, and she decided it wasn't too late. Sarah discovered attendance records showing that Clara had attended the adult literacy program for 2 terms before her name disappeared from the rolls. There was no notation explaining why she stopped. Perhaps the demands of work made it impossible to continue. Perhaps learning to read proved too difficult after a lifetime without formal education. Or perhaps, as Thomas had suggested in his diary, Clara had already learned what she most wanted to know. I remember the evening Mother read from the Bible for the first time, Thomas had written in 1930. I was about 14 years old. We were sitting at our small table after dinner, and Mother pulled out the family Bible she had purchased years before. She opened it to the Gospel of Luke and slowly, carefully, read aloud the words of the Magnificat. "He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly." Her voice shook with emotion, and when she finished, she closed the book and sat in silence for a long time. Then she looked at me and said, "Now I know what these words mean. Now I can read them for myself." That was the only time I ever saw Mother cry. As Sarah continued her research, the portrait of Clara and Thomas began to circulate within academic and historical communities. Dr. Webb published an article about the photograph in the Journal of Southern History, analyzing it as evidence of how formerly enslaved people had used photography to assert their dignity and document their freedom. The article included high-resolution details of Clara's scarred wrists, along with the historical context Sarah had uncovered. The response was overwhelming. Descendants of other formerly enslaved people reached out, sharing their own family photographs and asking for help, researching the stories behind them. Historians recognized that Clara's portrait was part of a larger visual archive, documenting the transition from slavery to freedom, images that captured both the trauma of the past and the resilience of survivors. The Historical Preservation Society organized an exhibition titled Portraits of Freedom, Photography and Black Life in Reconstruction America. Clara's photograph was featured prominently, displayed alongside Jonathan Blake's handwritten note and excerpts from Thomas's diary. The exhibition also included historical context, maps showing the rice plantations of the South Carolina Lowcountry, documents from the Freedmen's Bureau, statistics on black education and economic progress during Reconstruction, and photographs of other formerly enslaved people who had left similar visual testimonies. Patricia Coleman attended the exhibition's opening in Richmond. She stood before her great-great-grandmother's portrait, now enlarged and expertly lit, Clara's scarred wrists clearly visible to all who looked. Visitors moved slowly through the gallery, reading the placards, studying the photographs, confronting the legacy of slavery and the determination of those who survived it. "I never knew," Patricia said quietly to Sarah as they stood together before the portrait. "All these years, this photograph hung in our family homes, passed down from generation to generation, and we never really saw what was there. We saw a nice portrait of ancestors dressed in their finest clothes. We didn't see the scars. We didn't ask the hard questions about what Clara had endured." Sarah nodded. "Sometimes we see what we're ready to see. Your family preserved this photograph, honored Clara's memory, passed down her legacy. Now we're able to understand the full story, to recognize not just her dignity in this portrait, but her survival, her strength, her sacrifice." The exhibition included a timeline of Thomas's life, drawn from census records, city directories, and newspaper archives. After completing his education, Thomas had worked for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway for 40 years, rising from track maintenance to a supervisory position. He had married a woman named Ruth in 1898, and they had 4 children. He had been active in his church, serving as a deacon and Sunday school teacher. He had lived to see his grandchildren attend integrated schools after Brown v. Board of Education, though he died before the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. He built a good life, Patricia said, because of what Clara sacrificed to give him that education, those opportunities. The legacy wasn't just the photograph. It was everything she did to make sure he could have a future she never had. 6 months after the exhibition opened, Sarah received an unexpected email from a woman named Catherine Ashford in Charleston. The name made Sarah pause. Ashford, the same surname as the plantation owner who had enslaved Clara. She opened the message cautiously. "Dear Dr. Mitchell," the email began, "I'm writing regarding your research on the woman named Clara who was enslaved on my family's plantation in Beaufort County. I am the great-great-granddaughter of Richard Ashford. I have recently discovered documents in my family's estate that I believe may be relevant to your work, and I would like to share them with you. I recognize that my family's history is difficult and painful, but I believe the truth should be known." Sarah called Catherine that evening. The woman's voice was measured, educated, carrying the accent of old Charleston families. "I found a trunk in my grandmother's attic," Catherine explained. "It contained plantation ledgers, correspondence, and personal papers belonging to Richard Ashford. Most of it is painful to read. The casual documentation of buying and selling human beings, the punishment logs, the complete absence of recognition that enslaved people were human beings, with families and feelings. But there are also documents that I think you should see." She sent scanned copies of letters Richard Ashford had written to his brother in 1863, complaining about disruptions caused by troublesome slaves attempting to escape. One letter specifically mentioned Clara. "The woman Clara, who has worked in the fields since childhood, attempted to flee last week. She was captured 3 miles from the property and has been confined in shackles as an example to the others. These people do not understand the beneficence we show them, providing food and shelter. They are ungrateful and require firm discipline." Sarah felt sick reading the words, even though she had seen similar language in countless historical documents. The letter confirmed what the plantation ledgers had indicated. Clara had been shackled as punishment for trying to claim her freedom 2 years before emancipation would make that freedom legal. But Catherine had found something else. A letter, dated April 1865, written hastily in different handwriting. "The Yankees have come. The slaves have all fled. The property is destroyed. We have lost everything." It was signed by Richard Ashford's wife, Margaret. "My family lost the plantation," Catherine said quietly. "They lost their wealth, their social position, everything they had built on the labor of enslaved people. And for generations, we told ourselves we were the victims of the war, of Northern aggression, a betrayal by the people we had cared for. It's taken me years to understand the depth of that delusion, to recognize what my ancestors really were." Sarah appreciated Catherine's honesty, but she also knew that acknowledgement alone didn't change history. "What will you do with these documents?" she asked. "I'm donating them to the South Carolina Historical Society," Catherine replied. "All of them. The ledgers, the letters, everything. They belong in a public archive where researchers and descendants can access them. People like Clara's family deserve to know their ancestors' stories, even the painful parts. Especially the painful parts. And people like me need to face what our families did, not hide from it." Sarah thought about Clara, standing in Jonathan Blake's studio in 1885, her son beside her, choosing to be photographed with her scars visible. Clara had not hidden from her past, even though she rarely spoke of it. She had lived with the evidence of what she had endured, and she had chosen to document herself not as a victim, but as a survivor. A free woman, a mother, a person who had claimed dignity despite everything that had tried to strip it from her. The exhibition remained open for 6 months, drawing thousands of visitors. Educators brought school groups to view the photographs and discuss the legacy of slavery. Descendants of enslaved people came to honor the resilience of their ancestors. The portrait of Clara and Thomas became one of the most discussed historical photographs of the year, featured in documentaries, textbooks, and museum collections across the country. Patricia Coleman donated the original photograph to the Historical Preservation Society, ensuring it would be preserved and accessible to future generations. She kept a high-quality reproduction in her home, but she wanted the original to serve a larger purpose. On the day she signed the donation papers, Patricia stood with Sarah in the conservation lab, where Clara's portrait would be stored in a climate-controlled vault protected from light and decay. "She wanted us to see her," Patricia said softly, looking at her great-great-grandmother's face. "That's why she had this portrait made, why she didn't hide her scars, why she dressed in her finest clothes and brought her son to that studio. She wanted to be seen, remembered, honored, not as a slave, but as a person who had survived slavery and built a life anyway." Sarah nodded. "And now she is. Clara's story is part of the historical record now. Her strength, her sacrifice, her love for her son, all of it is documented and preserved. She left us evidence, and we're finally learning to read it." The photograph remained in its vault, carefully preserved. But copies circulated widely, in exhibitions, publications, classrooms, and homes. Clara's face looked out from the frame across nearly 140 years, her scarred wrists visible proof of what she had endured, her dignified bearing, testament to what she had overcome. The portrait that had seemed like just another 19th century studio photograph had revealed itself to be something more, a document of survival, a declaration of freedom, and a mother's love captured in silver and light. Thomas had written one final entry about his mother in his diary, dated 1946, 6 years before his own death. I'm an old man now, and Mother has been gone for 40 years, but I carry her with me every day. The sacrifices she made, the strength she showed, the love she gave, these are my inheritance, more valuable than any material wealth. When I look at that photograph of us together, taken when I was just a boy, I see not just a portrait, but a promise kept. Mother promised herself that I would be free in ways she never was, that I would have opportunities denied to her, that I would know my worth as a human being. She kept that promise, and in keeping it, she showed me what love truly means.